Chapter 6.
Arming oneself with bow and arrow, when one's rivals are poised so temptingly across the lawn, is not the wisest of exercises,
Charlotte announced. Sulking, she dropped down in one of the chairs beneath a sun canopy. Returning from the refreshment table, Madelyn handed her friend a glass of lemonade.
That is, if you chose to wear your spectacles. Without them, I wager you'd miss your intended female competitors and tragically pierce the heart of his lordship instead.
Charlotte accepted the drink with a distracted thank you. Her envious gaze was fastened at a point across the lawn, where Harriet Beauchamp was currently standing on tiptoe, whispering into Lord Tristan's ear. He wore the flamboyant costume of his archery society, a dark green frock coat and cape, white shirt, cravat and breeches, and a rounded hat adorned with a plump white ostrich plume. He was dressed to impress, Madelyn surmised, and from the numerous admiring glances, with the exception of herself, he was doing a smashing job. Bernadette Fairborn, her Cupid's bow mouth pursed in an insistent pout, waited impatiently for his assistance, while her sister Belinda stood with arms crossed over her chest, glaring at Harriet, who shot answering daggers out of her eyes. Madelyn was instantly reminded of a picture in a book she once saw of a pack of lionesses, snarling at one another over the carcass of a felled gazelle. Laura Ellis and Julian Campbell huddled together some distance behind them, giggling into their gloved hands while sneaking glances at the Duke, the same man Madelyn had landed on an hour ago. Presenting a handsome picture, he sat upon a marvellous black stallion on a far hill, watching them all for the past 15 minutes as his horse stamped impatiently at the soft ground.
"Look how they all hover around him,"
Charlotte cried out, effectively pulling Madelyn's attention back to Lord Tristan.
"They've not a stitch of modesty between them. So flirty, so brazen. Can you believe it, Maddie?"
Frankly, yes.
Madelyn responded matter-of-factly.
And I dare say he's rather enjoying their artful manoeuvring.
Her voice trailed away when, out of the corner of her eye, she saw the Duke urge his mount into a trot. Her heartbeat skittered as he turned toward the sun canopy. She'd managed to avoid him earlier while she and Charlotte attempted to try their luck aiming for the targets, and now fretted that he was coming over to speak with her.
"I mean, really? How do they expect the man to breathe?"
Charlotte cut in, fairly slamming her glass atop the table.
"Upon my word, his lordship must be annoyed beyond repair."
I rather believe he's in his element.
Madelyn remarked with a wry smile.
Just look how he smiles, all lopsided and lazy. He drifts from lady to lady like a bee amid a cloud of honeysuckle.
Making a stab at subtlety, she pretended to look at a copse of trees to her right. The Duke had disappeared.
"You're right,"
Charlotte said dismally.
"Lord Tristan has been more than attentive to everyone's archery form, but mine."
Yes, I noticed that as well. But you must consider he responds well to their boldness. You, dear, have no reason to feel lacking. Your sense of discretion is charming. A credit the right man will undoubtedly appreciate. They have only their shamelessness to recommend them.
Charlotte sighed, her face an image of pure dejection.
"I mustn't blame them,"
she said, still staring across the lawn.
"'Tis not their fault but my own. I fear I cannot help the fact that he finds me so very, very dull."
Nonsense,
Madelyn answered, hating the fact her friend was already falling into the depths of self-pity, and this only their 5th day at Wolverest.
If you whimpered at his heels for attention like a neglected hound, Lord Tristan would be fawning over you as well. The Devine men simply prefer forward women. That you should like such a man fairly rattles my sensibilities.
The jangle of a harness and movement in the corner of her eye turned Madelyn's head. The Duke's horse was being led to the stable by a groomsman, the Duke now nowhere to be seen. And just why should I care to notice? Looking down, she adjusted the laces of her protective gloves with sharp tugs.
I say, I don't know where his grace went off to, but if he plans on coming anywhere near me, I'll shoot him in the foot. providing I have my bow and arrow in hand.
I find that exceedingly improbable, even at close range.
Madelyn turned to see the Duke of Wolverest, shockingly minus his coat. He leaned his back against the thick trunk of a nearby oak tree, his discarded coat resting on a low branch. Sunlight filtered through the leaves above, rendering his tousled raven-black hair dappled in shades of light and shadow. His white shirt sleeves were rolled up to just above his elbows, and his tanned hands rested on his lean hips. He looked windblown and alluringly refreshed, like he only just returned from a vigorous ride. Reluctantly, Madelyn acknowledged the surge of anticipation that made her pulse quicken, her breath catch from being the focus of his attention. She was attracted to this handsome, sleek, virile man, had suspected so ever since their first encounter. She'd be an idiot not to admit so to herself, but that didn't mean she should act upon her attraction. Surely he couldn't be the only man in England who could make her flesh grow peculiarly warm under his gaze. Besides, he was a Devine, a name famously associated with shattered hearts for as long as she could remember. It was even reputed his own dear mother died of a broken heart. Her gaze pulled to his snug black breeches as he bent one knee to rest his booted foot against the tree trunk. She wondered how much he had heard of her and Charlotte's conversation.
How long have you been standing there?
Just.
He crossed his lean muscled arms over his chest.
Miss Green, if I may offer you a little advice.
Wide-eyed, Charlotte turned in her seat at the sound of the Duke addressing her, so caught up was she in studying Lord Tristan's interaction with the other ladies.
Yes,
she fairly squeaked.
Timidity is beneath his detection. If you want to gain his notice, you'll have to step up to the challenge.
She nodded, her lashes fluttering in apparent astonishment at his casualness.
Ah, thank you.
He inclined his head, his intent blue gaze swinging back to Madelyn. As she returned his stare, she wondered why he chose to grace them with his noble presence after claiming he'd do otherwise in the orangery. Perhaps he joined their party to plague her with further mortification. Surely he must be aware that his presence here only reminded her of their encounter in the topiary garden the hour before.
You were saying?
He prompted.
Was I saying anything?
She rushed out, worrying if she'd spoken her thoughts out loud.
As I remember, you were threatening to impale my foot.
He stated, a spark of humour in his eyes.
Oh, it was an empty threat, Your Grace. You needn't worry.
He laughed, flashing her a peek at straight white teeth.
I assure you, love, an arrow shot by your hand would never find its mark.
She straightened.
Is that so?
He nodded his head slowly, smiling like a scoundrel as he reeled her in effortlessly.
You jerked the shot, and your positioning is poor.
It wasn't at all surprising someone noticed her clumsy performance, but it was surprising that he noticed.
You were watching me?
She asked.
All these women here and you managed to stay focused on my poor archery poise? I must say I find you quite talented.
He grinned.
Ladies have said as much in the past.
Clearly he was left unscathed by her sarcasm.
Yes, but were any of them true ladies?
She muttered under her breath.
Pardon?
She blinked like an owl.
What?
I believe you said something.
She smiled brightly. He shot her a narrowed glance, his eyes vividly blue and vividly disbelieving.
She
cleared her throat.
We were discussing my shortcomings.
A topic she was well acquainted with.
You close your eyes just before release,
he said.
A dangerous flaw, to say the least.
Somehow, hearing him say she was flawed hurt. It was certainly a different reaction than when Priscilla or her aunt pointed it out.
And you are an expert?
I am a second-generation member of the Toxopholite Society.
The name of the archery society that the Prince Regent himself belonged to did little to impress Madelyn. She supposed the club was probably only created as an excuse to socialise and drink spirits to worrisome excess.
And I belong to the Company of Scottish Archers,
he added. He just had to throw that in. Fine. So he might know what he was talking about. He studied her for a moment, then pushed off the tree.
Would you care for a demonstration?
She shrugged.
That is, if you think your sensibilities shan't be rattled.
He challenged with a playful grin. So he had been listening to their conversation.
Surely I can handle your tutoring, Your Grace.
I doubt that,
he murmured. Striding over to the canopy, he ducked under it and offered her his arm.
Miss Green, if you'll excuse us.
Charlotte nodded quickly. Madelyn wondered if her friend's eyeballs would ever return to normal size. Hesitantly, Madelyn placed her hand on the Duke's arm, instantly feeling the heat of his skin, even through the thickness of her glove. He escorted her toward Lord Tristan and his giggling gaggle of females, and paused at one of the tables to retrieve a bow and the quiver full of arrows.
Brother, whatever inspired you to join us?
Lord Tristan approached, the white plume in his hat bobbing with each step.
Is the dear Miss Haywood in need of assistance?
Nice hat.
The Duke said over his shoulder, walking with Madelyn past the small crowd.
Thank you.
Lord Tristan returned, his tone clearly questioning his brother's sincerity. Madelyn still on his arm, the Duke spun on his heel, apparently remembering protocol.
Ladies,
He said in general greeting to the group at large before bowing his head briefly. A ruffling of fabric ensued as 5 young women sank into deep curtsies, accompanied by a chorus of
Your Graces.
Turning, he directed Madelyn at a brisk pace down the row, past the last remaining target post, and through a copious group of birch trees. Just where was he taking her, she wondered. All the targets were set on the very part of the lawn which they were walking away from. Surely he didn't mean to instruct her somewhere private. That would be exceedingly improper. She glanced over her shoulder with concern.
Must we be so very far away?
He looked down at her with an "are you kidding me" expression.
the farther away you are from living beings, the safer I feel. I wouldn't want any unnecessary injuries dampening the festive mood.
Ha!
She gasped, offended.
Don't be silly. I'm not that bad.
I'm never silly, and yes, you are.
That's preposterous. Charlotte nearly speared the gardener, and he was 20 metres to the right.
Yes, but you must consider the fact Miss Green failed to bring her spectacles. Had she wore them, I'm quite certain she'd have hit the bullseye every time.
How did you know she wore spectacles?
Her interview.
Oh.
It was all she could mutter at the moment, her mind now busy with thoughts of the other girls' interviews. Had theirs been cut short as hers was? Had Rosalind been sent away as well? Did he fancy any of them for himself? That last unforeseen thought jolted her out her musings as quickly as if someone pinched her. Looking about, she saw they had stopped just on the other side of the clump of birches. To her left, about 15 metres away, sat another target completely blocked from view from the other guests by the collage of trees. She turned, meeting his suddenly serious expression with a suspicious one of her own.
You must forgive my directness, but as I'm sure you are aware of the reputation of the Devine men, and seeing as how the chaperones are taking tea with your sister at the castle presently, do you mean to seduce me?
A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took a step closer, leaving only enough space for the tube of arrows between them, the bow being held at his side. A cool gust of wind sifted through them, sending his clean, soapy scent and a hint of leather in her direction.
I mean we are rather separated from the rest of the group,
she said, trembling a bit. He tilted his head in an assessing manner, examining her with such a charming grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. She fought the urge to smile back and bask in his attention. Good Lord, why will he not say something? He leaned forward a touch, as if about to indulge her of a wicked secret.
Do you want me to?
She threw a hand to her throat.
Of course not.
I thought I should inquire. You looked almost hopeful,
he said, his eyes sparkling with mischief.
I certainly did not.
She swallowed, secretly worrying that she had looked pitifully expectant.
You must have mistaken my concern for personal security for anticipation. Your reputation is rather tarnished.
Nodding like he'd made up his mind about just what sort of woman she was, he said,
Guilty by association, is it? Tell me what you've heard, and I shall venture to enlighten you. Really, Miss Haywood, I've no ulterior motives where you are concerned.
Humph. I've a mind to think it's all part of the Devine plan, to appear innocent and lure your victims in.
If I were going to seduce you,
he said quietly,
would I increase your odds of deflecting my advances by arming you with weapons?
Blushing, she gave a short, soft laugh.
Well, no.
She said, her embarrassment so strong her skin felt prickly. Why in the world did she think, even for a second, this man would want to seduce her? A little nobody with little money, a small dowry, and even less in good looks. Of that she could have no doubt. Priscilla constantly reminded her that her curves bordered on too generous. Her thick red hair, too. Well, red. Oh dear, what an idiot he must think her. She rummaged around her thoughts, looking for a way to change the subject.
I'm wondering...
He looked so handsome, gazing down at her expectantly. The wind stirred the thick black locks curling around his collar, and his eyes matched the colour of the sky today. She knew it was her imagination again, or some trick of his, but he had the appearance of... well, he almost looked as if he enjoyed her company. She smiled tightly, reminding herself not to fall again for his effortless charm.
At my interview, you said you'd stay away. And now here you are, standing in front of me.
And shamefully too near, she added to herself.
Indeed. But that was before.
He paused to shake a lock of black hair out of his eyes with a toss of his head.
You see, I couldn't resist.
Resist what?
You.
She supposed he meant only to tease her again, but his intent gaze and the intimate timbre of his voice flushed her traitorous body with heat. Swallowing hard, she realized her protective wall was cracking under his onslaught of subtle flirtation. However did this man manage to both infuriate and charm her with only his presence? 1 minute she steadfastly assumed she could ignore him, and the next she warmed to his gentle teasing. He continued to stare down at her, his body blocking out the rest of the world. The wind dislodged a lock of her hair and the breeze took it, tickling her cheek. She reached up to rub the curl away at the same time he did, only he got there first. Her fingertips brushed the back of his hand. To an onlooker, it would appear he was caressing her cheek, and she was encouraging him. She let her hand drop away, thinking he'd do the same, and he did, but not before tucking the coil behind her ear. His heavy-lidded gaze dropped to her mouth. She wouldn't fall for that ploy again. Reflexively, she licked her lips, then fixed her attention on his shirt, which did little to calm her nerves. A slit between buttonholes offered her a peek of his golden skin. She nearly gulped.
Shall we begin the lesson?
She asked, somehow finding the courage to look up at him again. He nodded slowly, his pensive expression pulling into a scowl. Finally, he tore his fixed stare away from her lips and threw a glance at the stand holding the bullseye across the way.
This one's only 15 meters away,
he said, sounding a bit cross.
Turn around.
She blinked a few times, not quite sure she understood him. Making a circle in the air with her finger, she looked at him askance.
That's right. Turn around.
With her pale muslin dress fluttering in the breeze, she did as he commanded, presenting her back to him. He stepped in close behind her, the folds of her dress billowing in and around his legs. Instantly, the heat emanating from his body spread across her back.
First, one must find a proper stance.
His deep, cultured voice sounded just above her left ear. She tried to ignore the tiny ripples of shivers running down her neck to her shoulders.
Your initial instinct was to turn in and face your target, but this will only cause you to shoot low.
Then how is it I should stand?
She asked, her voice shaky.
Were you not observing the other ladies?
He stood so close to her back, she felt every word he wrapped his lips around.
No, I did not.
Too busy watching my brother?
She closed her eyes, her neck bent slightly to the side, secretly allowing his breath to feather across her skin as he spoke. Lord, she'd lost her fortitude.
If I had been listening to his lordship,
she murmured.
I gather I would have known how to stand. Besides, you of all people know I have no interest in Lord Tristan.
He said quietly.
Which makes it all the more likely he'll choose you.
Her eyes flew open at his words, but before she could ask him what he meant, he slid one booted foot in between her feet. She gasped.
Your Grace?
Please cease the formality and address me by my Christian name.
Thank you, but no. I'm not falling for that again.
At least in private, then.
She shook her head.
I insist.
It wouldn't be proper.
Neither is climbing out a window with your skirts hitched up to your waist. Come now, let us be friends. I dare say I've seen more of your body in the last couple of days than any
Stop.
She said curtly, her face flushed with heat.
That's enough, fine, I acquiesce. Gabriel it is.
Friends, he says. Why did that irk her so?
And may I call you by your given name?
No.
She said flatly. The deep sound of his answering laughter rumbled behind her. She smiled freely, guessing he wouldn't be able to see. Placing a warm hand on the swell of her hip, he gently nudged her feet apart.
Slide your left foot back a bit,
he said, a smile in his voice. She complied. Then her breath caught, as his knee brushed the back of her thigh.
Once you've mastered this stance, you can choose from countless others.
His tone changed. Although it was a tone of simple instruction, the air dripped with sensuality, like he was no longer speaking of archery, but of some dark, sinful delight of which she could only imagine.
Are you paying attention?
Mm-hmm.
She managed softly.
I ask because you've closed your eyes again.
What?
She blinked herself out of a stupor and straightened her spine.
Is the wasp sting still bothering you? You should have tried my key.
It wasn't necessary.
The last thing she wanted to discuss with him was the state of her bottom.
I've fully recovered.
Good.
He cleared his throat.
Practice each position over and over. Compare the results of your release. And with time, you will discover which one is more pleasurable for you.
What are we talking about?
Your stance.
Without retreating from his wicked nearness, he reached around her, offering her the bow.
Take it,
he said, his breath feathering her earlobe. She grasped the bow, holding it tightly between her thumb and index finger.
Relax your grip,
he said softly.
Take the arrow. Raise it. Draw. Hold.
The man was positively on fire. The presence of his body heat was distracting her thoughts. As her hands shook, she regretted appearing so visibly apprehensive. As attentive as his brother was to the other ladies, she had never seen him take the liberty of standing so sinfully near. Truly, if she were to take a step back, she'd be pressed up tight against him. The thought secretly thrilled her.
This is why you jerked the shot,
he said, removing his hand from her hip to settle it over her drawing hand.
Relax.
Calming myself at this point is out of the question. You are standing too close.
She finished quickly, as if running out of air. After a brief hesitation that felt like an eternity, he took one step back. But it wasn't nearly enough. Her heart still palpitated, and she felt undeniably overheated.
Look at your target. Concentrate on keeping your eyes open,
he said, while manipulating her fingers underneath his into the correct position.
Allow the string to slip off your fingers without moving your hands.
He finally stepped fully away from her, allowing a rush of cool air to race up her back. Madelyn held her position, allowing time to regain her senses.
I'll miss, I know it. I'm simply too clumsy for this sport,
she said after a few steadying breaths.
Nonsense. When you're ready, release.
Taking a deep breath, she aimed the shot.
Eyes open,
the Duke playfully reminded her.
Yes, my eyes are open.
She deliberately widened them for emphasis. There was a flicking sound, not a twang, as she'd heard earlier, and her arrow flew through the air, hitting the outermost ring. It wasn't a bull's eye, but she hit the target, not the lawn or a bush or an ill-fated gardener's bottom, but an actual target. Astonished, she whirled around to face him.
Well done,
the Duke said warmly, giving her shoulder a gentle pat.
I can't believe I did it,
she said, beaming up at him. He smiled at her enthusiasm, the skin around the corners of his eyes crinkling.
Of course you did. I instructed you.
She rolled her eyes.
I know for you it must seem a rather insignificant triumph, but for me...
She sighed, satisfied. For the next quarter of an hour she continued to practice and Gabriel continued to instruct. He grinned and patted her shoulder when she did well, after she stopped jumping up and down in celebration, of course, and offered her further coaching when she did poorly. He continued to stand close enough to brush up against her every now and again, but she soon became used to it and often found herself seeking the shield of his broad chest when a chilly gust raced across the lawn. All too soon they ran out of arrows and agreed to retrieve them together.
My stepmother wouldn't believe it if she witnessed it with her own eyes.
Come now, Miss Haywood. Surely you discredit yourself.
The statement came from Lord Tristan, who emerged from the trees with a swagger, his pastel entourage following in his wake. With dark auburn locks, long straight nose, and a strong squared jaw, there was no denying Lord Tristan was handsome, in a romantic sense. But Madelyn thought his cool blue eyes exemplified an adolescent shallowness. Mayhap in about 5 years his mind would catch up to his outward appearance. Except for the blue eyes, he looked very little like Gabriel, he of the dark and brooding. It struck Madelyn that maybe it was why she found Gabriel so charming. He didn't have the appearance of a man who smiled warmly or often. But when he did, it seemed to knock the breath straight out of her. It transformed his entire face. Truly, if he'd frequent London ballrooms and quit sulking so often, she rather thought all the ladies would be flocking at his feet instead of scurrying from his scowl.
The ladies are distressing,
Tristan said, straightening his hat.
that you might be changing your mind about this whole not taking a bride thing.
Don't agonize, Tristan. Seeing as how your hands were so delightfully full while tutoring, I chose to lighten your task and assist Miss Haywood myself.
Why would I agonize? It's not as if you're a challenge to me.
And a challenge would trouble you.
Of course. I would feel horrible when you embarrassed yourself trying to prove you were a better shot.
Madelyn watched the exchange between brothers with avid interest. She wasn't sure how it started, but the spark of competition flared between them seemingly out of nowhere.
All right then,
Lord Tristan said, pointing east.
the apple tree next to the rose pavilion.
And what a sad little apple tree it was. Madelyn squinted, barely making out a single red apple hanging high on an otherwise naked branch. Poor thing stood separated from the rest of the orchard, which was enclosed with walls for protection from the wind and the rain.
About 40 meters away.
Lord Tristan informed the group.
First one to hit that lone apple gets to escort Miss Haywood back to the castle.
The Duke inclined his head, accepting the challenge. He swept his hand forward, indicating his brother go first. Madelyn wasn't sure how she felt about being someone's prize, but she wasn't about to let it go to her head. After all, she surmised, surely they weren't fighting over her. That would be preposterous. Lord Tristan stepped forward, giving himself ample room. He held out his empty hand, waiting a moment before Harriet murmured,
Oh,
and flounced over to him, handing him his bow and an arrow.
Thank you, Miss Beauchamp.
He said without turning to look at her. Taking up his stance with great ostentation, he drew back, held, aimed, and released. Madelyn was certain his lordship would win as she watched his arrow. A series of rapid whacking sounds rent the air as it slapped through a scattering of leaves on the branch just below the apple, then flew to the ground, jabbing into the dirt. Lord Tristan's throat convulsed in apparent vexation. Silence enveloped them. Madelyn pursed her lips and glanced around the group. Belinda Fairborn stepped forward.
"'Tis a shame the sun went behind the clouds, my lord. A distraction for sure."
And that bird chirping above our heads is quite irksome.
Her sister Bernadette added, pointing above her head.
Don't you agree, ladies?
Overly sincere choruses of
Yes.
and
Indeed.
followed the query. Lord Tristan turned, white plume bobbing, and grinned at them quite like he wholeheartedly agreed. A chuckle bubbled up inside Madelyn, but she managed to contain it. Her laughing eyes met Gabriel's as he took the bow out of her hand, his lingering touch skimming across her knuckles. He slid an arrow out of the quiver, then handed Harriet the tube. She took it, looking mightily pleased, leaning in close. Gabriel nodded his thanks distractedly, then strode over to stand next to his brother. Without any of Lord Tristan's pompous flair, he set his arrow, drew back, and held. Madelyn stared, transfixed, at his bare forearms. The muscles flexed and tightened as he aimed his shot. A whizzing sound rent the air as his arrow cut through the sky, ripping through the wind and slicing into the apple. The fruit dropped to the ground. Gabriel's arrow had split it in two.
Satisfied?
He asked, turning to his brother. Lord Tristan removed his hat, swooping down for a low bow.
I am humbled.
he said, straightening and returning his plumed hat atop his head. Gabriel nodded, slapping his brother on the back. Lord Tristan then took the bow from him and sauntered away, a fair-born twin on each arm, Harriet in the lead and Laura and Julienne on the ends, cooing in conciliation. Gabriel held out his arm to Madelyn.
My prize?
She placed her hand on his arm.
I'm not so sure I'm fit to be anyone's prize.
Come now, Miss Haywood. Tell me you're not the sort to fish for a compliment.
Her face flushed with heat. She wasn't sure why she'd made the comment, but baiting him for praise wasn't one of them.
No, of course not.
She replied, forcing a small laugh.
Haha.
Good,
He said, sliding a glance at her.
because a beautiful woman should never plead for flattery.
Taken aback, she glanced at his handsome profile. He was frowning, looking ahead as they walked on. Beautiful? Just the other day, he claimed she wasn't even pretty. They entered the copse of trees, Lord Tristan and the other girls already far ahead.
I'm quite impressed by your accuracy.
She said with sincerity.
Truth be told,
He replied, still looking forward.
I'm surprised he missed. He's quite a good shot, really.
It's the feather. Perhaps it threw him off balance.
To her surprise, he threw back his head for a short bark of laughter.
You could be right, love.
They emerged from the trees, making their way across the lawn, Lord Tristan and the others far ahead. Madelyn turned toward the castle but was jerked to the left as the Duke veered in the opposite direction. Her brows drew together in a frown.
Are we not to return to the castle?
He nodded.
Are you not forgetting someone?
Her mind drew a blank, then suddenly she gasped.
Charlotte.
Together they approached the sun canopy, startling a daydreaming Charlotte. Gabriel bent low, offering her friend his other arm with a smile and a
Shall we?
Caught unawares, a pleasantly surprised Charlotte rose from her chair with a nervous smile. As the trio made their way back to the castle, Gabriel made polite conversation with Charlotte about the weather and its effects on his orchards, but Madelyn kept quiet. Two nagging concerns had wormed into her thoughts. The first was the shame she felt for forgetting that Charlotte still sat alone, and the second was the surge of reluctant admiration thrumming through her that the Duke had remembered.
What is, Papa?